In the past 2 episodes, we've covered the development of the Dutch 1895 long rifle and its nebulous family of Continental carbines. Today, we'll start all over again, this time in the East Indies. Hi, I'm Othais, and this should seem pretty familiar, but I promise it's not that same old Gewehr 1895. This one saw service in the East Indies, and also a little modification. Let's see if you can spot those differences while I put this in the light box. We are back up to an overall length of 51 inches and a weight hovering around 9.6 pounds depending. The magazine capacity is 5 rounds of 6.5 by 53 millimeter rimmed, and so this is very comparable to the Continental 1895. Don't forget, our hard work is only half of what makes this show, so you guys need to be the other half. Like, subscribe, comment, and share these videos with people you know who will enjoy them. And don't forget, you can support us directly on Patreon or Subscribestar. And in addition, we do have a shop over at C&Rsenal.com, so your money will at least get you some sweet swag. Let's go ahead and get back to the topic at hand, though. I suppose this episode is going to need a fair smattering of context because for those of you who weathered the first 2 episodes of this 3-episode series, you probably feel like you've seen more variations of this rifle than any we've covered before. Well, you're over the halfway point at least. We've walked down those models issued to the Army and the Navy right up until 1940. I admit we skipped a couple of later police carbines, and we're not covering any of the sub-caliber training rifles, so even after all this series of episodes, there's still going to be more Dutch Mannlichers for you to discover out there, but that's going to require your own time. For now, let's do our best and start our work all over again in Indonesia. Or, as it was known at the time, the Dutch East Indies, the nationalized colonies of the Dutch East India Company, which came under government administration in 1800. In 1814, by royal decree, a new army separate from the Continental Army was formed to oversee, protect, and expand the Dutch colonial holdings. The natural course was a series of campaigns, some gathered into wars like the Padri or Java War, but most important to us today was the Aceh War. Alright, let me try a bird's eye rundown here. The Sultanate of Aceh, a protectorate of the Ottoman Empire since the 16th century, was, for that region, a fairly powerful domain, both in terms of military strength and commercial trade. At one point, half the world's supply of pepper came from this sultanate. By the late 1860s, the Sultanate had seen a period of internal disorder, but soon the various rogue Rajas were brought under control and Aceh began a new southern expansion. The Dutch, however, were already in the south and moving northwards, and this put them on a sort of geopolitical collision course. Previously, Aceh had been politically shielded by the arguing and posturing between Britain and the Netherlands in Sumatra, but from 1867 to 1871, the Dutch and British negotiated better terms all around for their colonial interactions, and in this exchange, the Dutch were granted a free hand in the East Indies. So when the Aceh got in the way of their expansion, well, by 1873 it was officially a war, one that would last until 1904, again officially, although insurgent action would continue for at least another decade and then reappear against the Japanese in World War II. The Aceh War and its necessary campaigns and conflicts will remain the most pressing concern for the Dutch colonial army for the majority of our episode, really until the very last end of it when a bigger threat appears. By the way, this is the official name of that colonial army. I'm not even going to try this one, folks. The English translation is Royal Dutch East Indies Army. The shortened version, however, is KNIL, which is often how the guns we're about to discuss are labeled by collectors. Alright, now that's a lot of context in a very small package, but we need to talk about some rifles. Recall from our first Dutch episode that this is the 1895 long rifle, a design resulting from a series of tests mostly focused around an 1892 trials pattern. 100 of these guns had been ordered for the Continental Army and 100 more for trials by the KNIL. These were to be issued to a new colonial reserve, which was being assembled and trained in the Netherlands and would be shipped out in 1893 along with the new rifles. They are in a unique pattern separate from the Continental. Some debate about sling positions and what would make the best possible bayonet led to 25 more rifles being assembled, and so 125 experimental long arms made the trip to the Far East in 1893. Now, from our last episode, we already know the final pattern for the original 1895 long rifle, and representatives of the KNIL were on hand for that rifle commission, also signing off on that particular design. However, internally there was a conflict. Many officers actually stationed in the Indies were pretty unhappy with the new trials rifles. They were seen as too long and too heavy, especially for use by indigenous troops who were much shorter and lighter than their European counterparts. This problem was aggravated as the KNIL troops favored leaving their bayonets fixed while on the march, with an emphasis on readiness in case of an ambush, which was a real possibility. In that same vein, slings were considered a possible hindrance to the soldier. The 400mm Zero was way too long. Jungle warfare meant that they wanted 200 meters or less. Unfortunately, being so far from home, these concerns did not make much of a splash at the committee. Each problem was kindly explained away. You can just not put the sling over your shoulder, and no, we're not making a special lightened, permanently fixed bayonet. You can just use the same bayonet lug as everyone else. It saves us money and consideration. And while this argument was going on, something of a sideshow conflict, the Dutch intervention at Lombok, kicked off. Okay, more history. The island of Lombok, populated by the Muslim Sasak people, was at the time under the rule of a Balinese court. The natural friction of this situation resulted in a series of failed rebellions. In 1891, things kicked off again, but this time the Sasak appealed to the Dutch, who saw it as an open invitation to secure their authority over more land. So they intervened against the Balinese forces. A naval blockade proved to be insufficient, so they would actually commit ground forces. Initially, the Balinese Raja seemed to surrender, but then he launched a sneak attack at night on the primary Dutch position, a 900-man-strong camp. The Balinese were armed with Winchester repeating rifles, models 1873, and apparently some Spencers. The Dutch had the Boma, which the KNIL had never updated to a magazine loader, and perhaps maybe some rolling blocks, so all the way around, single-shot rifles for the Dutch and repeaters for the opposition. They were routed in their biggest defeat of the 19th century, nearly 100 dead, another 160 or so wounded and lost, and some would later succumb to their injuries off the battlefield. The commanding general was killed, and their cannon and supplies were captured. Now, in the broader history, this would result in a punitive second expedition, one that razed the Balinese palaces to the ground, but for our story, it put a bit more pressure on that question of having a repeating bolt-action rifle in KNIL hands, even as far out as the East Indies, and it lit something of a fire under the adoption process, quickly dispelling the nagging arguments about coming up with an entirely different gun for, the Dutch East Indies. So this is just about the final product, nearly identical to the original 1895 rifle, although now sporting a 200-meter zeroed rear sight and a little upturn in the finger rest. The attached bayonet was not, however, the same T-back as in Europe. It is now a double-edged dagger pattern, which is actually what that later Continental Cavalry model that we already saw last episode was based on. These KNIL long rifles were actually ordered from Steyr at about the same time as the first Continental carbines, December of 1896. 36,000 would be ordered. The first guns started leaving the Netherlands in April of 1897, with the balance of this order arriving within the year. 5,000 would again be purchased from OEWG in 1899, and over the years, at least 5,000 more came from Hembrugge in 1915, although there are signs of an unknown quantity from a 1918 order. So perhaps as many as 50,000 total, although likely fewer. Now, usually I should be saying, let's take a closer look, but If you're eagle-eyed, you can probably spot that this rifle isn't exactly like the gun in that drawing, and that's because the NIL rifle had a difficult niche to fill. We already spoke about how it had to be light and compact enough for native levies. It also had to be ready at a moment's notice in case of an ambush and capable of close-range bayonet fighting. It had to be handy for maneuvering on narrow trails and dense foliage, which it also had to penetrate readily with enough extra force to stop a charging spearman. On top of all of that work pointed into the colonies, it also had to be capable of being pointed out from the colonies. It needed to stand toe-to-toe with other then modern European rifles capable of being used at long ranges, on the coast, or even from ships. It was a gun that was meant for two types of distinctly different warfare, and frankly, it failed at both. The NIL kind of hated these things right from the start. They were too long for the indigenous people, and so were almost exclusively issued to the European troops. Another glaring issue is that the new bayonet sheaths, all of them were steel, and were loose enough to rattle a lot. All 36,000 had to be scrapped and a new design worked up. Even while that was being cleaned up, NIL officials started trying to shorten and lighten that 1895 long rifle. From 1898 to 1904, at least 3 major variations of lightened gun were trialed and rejected for this or that reason. Barrels were cut down or turned down, longer bayonets fitted, individual parts were ground thinner, all sorts of stuff. Many designs were actually successful in terms of their function, but the actual costs were too high for conversion. During all of this, sometime around 1902, an experimental bayonet was worked up. This was the plainest possible design I've ever known. Flat steel with a notch, no grips, nada. Designed to be as light as possible. We will actually see this return later in the episode. Just wanted you to be aware of where it came from right now. Strangely, that ultralight 1902 style bayonet was not used in what became the 1904 pattern rifle. The 1904 would be the most successful attempt at lightening the 1895. They ditched the bayonet lug and cleaning rod, shortened the barrel and stock, adopted a simplified tangent rear sight, and sported a 2-piece handguard and a rubber butt pad. Testing proved satisfactory for the most part, and the new lightened pattern was recommended for adoption with very minor changes. The only problem was no one would give the NIL any money to buy them. But they found another option. At this time, the Netherlands were seeking more machine guns, and it was turning into a toss-up. The NIL wanted the Maxim, and the Home Army wanted the Schwarzlose. Whichever gun was chosen, the funds had already been set aside by the Dutch Parliament. Well, the rifle problem was so acute that the NIL dropped their request for Maxim guns, or really any machine guns at all. They even dissolved their machine gun department in October of 1905, deciding to spend that money on conversions of these long rifles. Parliament, however, were furious. They had not marked the money for, rifles. They had marked them for machine guns. They're not going to just spend all that money lightening up some guns, you lazy sons of... So the funds were pulled and the project dropped entirely. None of it was adopted. There would never be a shortening program for the NIL 1895, at least not by the Dutch. Instead, in 1911, the NIL did what little they could with a much simplified lightening program and came up with this gun that I have here. So let me show you what little tiny bit that they managed to do. Alright guys, working from front to back, we have, this looks Continental, doesn't it? Same bayonet lug, same front sight with dovetail, all that. We have a short length of unhandguarded barrel, and then we have our rear barrel band, which is still pretty far forward on the gun. And then we have a big old handguard, which is no different in general appearance to our, 2 episodes ago, 1895 long rifle. What is different is this giant L-shaped finger rest, which turns up in here, I imagine, to help with being able to pop off this band when you go to disassemble the gun. The L-shaped part of it was actually present on the Trials gun to my knowledge, so that was an original feature, although why they would have that sort of hard cliff, I'm not really sure, other than possibly, again, to get at the handguard disassembly. Weird. It was, however, much smaller. It was like the original 1895 long rifles on the Continent. It would be turned up a little bit here, come down to maybe here, and then all this extra this working back, this working forward, this was carved out in 1911 in order to lighten the gun up as much as they possibly could. It's been done on both sides. Now, going all the way back to their adoption, they had the same quadrant-style rear sight as the Continental. However, if you can get a good look at it, we go down to a 3 marking, and I've been told that the lowest setting is a 200 meter 0. Whether it's 200 or 300, it's still lower than the 400 meter setting of the original Continental guns. Now, if I walk her back, we're going to see additional modification to the handguard, and that's not just to lighten it in this case. So it would have been 90 degrees like this originally. Now we have this forward taper, and it's on both sides. So if I flip this guy over, you'll see it tapers again, and it may be even clearer on this side to see that we've also added a hole. There's a little gas escape hole here. There's one on the other side, and then actually, if I take the bolt out, and flip her over, you'll see there's one right here on the bolt. These gas relief holes were added, to the best of my knowledge, during the 1911 process, although similar holes were present, again, on the Trials gun. It feels like some of this process was to lighten it and some of it was to get back to features that they saw on their Trials rifles. Otherwise, same Schlegel-Mannlicher action. Nothing going on here different than the Continental, nothing worth exploring. 5-round end block, you get the drill. As I come to the rear, the only other real point of interest that we're going to see on this guy is the fact that we actually have a cutout in the stock and a ability to put a unit designating plate in here. So as much as you might think of this as a lightning procedure to remove more wood, it's not, because a brass piece would have been fitted in there that told us a little bit more about where this gun belonged at the time. Those are very often missing from these. As a matter of fact, these guns coming out of Indonesia are usually in much worse shape than this. This is one of the nicest ones I've seen, and it still has, if I flip it over, a currently somewhat failing wood patch that's been inlaid into it, because, let's be frank, the Indonesian environment is extremely rough on wood, especially for wood that is, let's see, the date on this is 1896. Well, boy, this is off the first order of rifles. I'm sure the stock's been changed out at some point, if not multiple times repaired over. So these guns saw a lot of hard use and are usually in fairly poor shape today. If not, and the long rifles, by the way, stayed in this configuration. We're going to see the carbines had even harder lives, but more on that in just a moment. The last thing I want to leave you with is something that I can't actually show you, but I can talk about, which is that the other thing they did to lighten these guns up a little bit is on the slings, they originally were leather. They switched over to canvas webbing in order to get a little bit more weight off of their kit yet again. Now, in addition to all these modifications, the NIL did change their doctrine a bit. Most notably, they would go ahead and keep bayonets on their hip and then attach them before a known battle. Now, what little has been done to this gun obviously means there's no change in weight, well, not no, but very little change in weight, and no change in length. And so these remain issued primarily to the European troops. But at least we're caught up to our gun today, perhaps more appropriately called the 1895/11, right? Let's go ahead and put it in Mae's hands and see if she can feel any difference between this and the Continental.
Buy his groceries and was supposed to limburger cheese. Was that? Yeah, it was. Oh, so the Chinaman discovered sauerkraut? Not because the Dutch. Yeah, it was the Dutch. Oh, Louis. It was the Dutch. Who told you? The English didn't know enough to come in. The British go outnumbered 10 to 1, and who collected damages when old...
I know I can't really feel a difference at all, but luckily for all of you, this isn't the only gun the NIL adopted. As a matter of fact, if we turn the clock back once again all the way to 1893, we'll find that even as the NIL was trialing the new long rifle, they were also investigating a carbine, this time with only 40 units made in 2 configurations. 20 to be worn on the back with a bent bolt handle, and 20 that favored being worn actually on the saddle, so in a big old saddle holster. They could, however, go on the back if needed. These sported a straight bolt handle and a front sight protector. Unlike the trial's long rifles, these carbines actually managed to serve in combat, with a dozen cavalrymen engaging a group of snipers armed with bow moss. Apparently, the new 6.5mm repeaters riddled the enemy position with bullets in record time, and even passed through the trees that were serving as the backstop for the whole show. Now, the straight bolt handle was found to be faster, but the bent was ultimately adopted because it was less likely to snag on the next man's saber when you were maneuvering in those tight jungle environments. In the end, they opted for something like this, a flush nose cap with sight protector, wood-covered magazine to protect the uniform, turned down bolt, and probably side slung. I'm actually not 100% sure on those sling positions at this point, and you'll see why in a moment. For those of you who saw last episode, I think you know what it means whenever I doubt a pattern. That means that the Dutch are going to change it in relatively soon, but let's get to numbers. 1,500 would be ordered in 1897 from OEWG. They were delivered in March of 1898. 1/3 were immediately stolen. Well, I should say requisitioned by another branch of the NIL. Instead of going to the cavalry, 500 of the new carbines were sent to the Marechaussee. These were not, however, the same organization that we saw last episode back home in Europe. The East Indies Marechaussee were something of a counter-guerrilla force and were officially part of the infantry. Made up of indigenous people and European officers, they were organized in smaller brigades. Light, fast, mobile, they acted with broad independent goals and were used to raid rebel camps, search and discover enemy leadership, or just dog any fleeing resistance into exhaustion. Before the Marechaussee, native opposition forces would often just flee into the interior with little follow-up from the colonial forces. After, well, they made sure the population knew that they could be found anywhere and at any time. Initially, they were armed with single-shot Remington carbines, but when the cavalry brought in, magazine repeaters, well, that's a handy force multiplier for such light, unsupported units. However, the guns weren't designed for infantry fighting and needed some modification. The nose cap was ditched since it wasn't necessary without a saddle holster. The wood magazine cover was dropped. New stocks were made, which were cut back and fitted with underside sling loops. Now, these were actually unique in that they were made of a lighter, flat steel pattern. I'll show you them in a moment. The overall shape was made official as the M95 Marechaussee. If you're curious why they skipped on the bayonet for infantrymen, well, the Marechaussee were more familiar with their infamous Clay Wong saber, a weapon that proved reliable in both jungle and psychological warfare. While only 500 Marechaussee carbines were made at first, they proved extremely effective, so much so that the Marechaussee would continue stealing piles from other departments. But I'll cover those as they come. In the end, through theft or just additional purchases from OEWG and AI and Hembrook, the number climbed to perhaps as many as 30,000 in total, making it far and away the most common carbine of the NIL and the most broadly issued. Over the decades, basically any unit that may need a carbine that I don't explicitly mention for the rest of this episode, well, they would have ended up with a Marechaussee. But let's get back to that original cavalry model for a moment. It's estimated between 8,000 and 10,000 cavalry carbines could have been produced over the course of its service. The only problem here is it's likely you'll never see one in this configuration, because even with the cavalry, changes would abound. Over years of service, it became apparent that the saddle holster method wasn't proving all that popular in the field, and troops were more comfortable just slinging the carbines on their backs. Since the only reason for the full stock and front sight protector was to make the gun compatible with said saddle holster, Well, why not ditch them for further weight savings if you're not going to carry them on the saddle? So, starting in 1899, the muzzle cap was dropped and the forestock cut back. Sling points were fitted on the left side, apparently different from the originals. I'm not sure how though, since I don't know the originals. I do know they ended up using the smaller, lighter, flat steel ribbon type like on the Marechaussee. Okay, so a pre-sporterized carbine, got it, but with the Dutch, there's always more. In 1902, the butt plates were skeletonized, further reducing weight. These were likely a development that came out as part of the long rifle lightning program that we discussed earlier. Around that same time, the bicycle units were starting to finally settle into the Indies, so in 1902, 20 experimental carbines would be made for cyclists. While I'm unsure of their exact configuration, they also borrowed from then ongoing lightened rifle trials. They took that bayonet that I mentioned earlier, the simple flat piece of steel, and tweaked it into an ultralight bicycle model. Now, this pattern would ultimately fail out, as the decision was made to arm the pedal-powered units with the same equipment as the cavalry. Sword and carbine, no bayonet. However, while that was going on, the artillery started researching their own carbine needs, and seeing the bicycle trials guns that were now abandoned, they realized with a few modifications it could be perfect as their reserve weapon to leave racked with their guns. In 1904, this is what they came up with, a 3/4 stocked carbine with a unique bayonet lug to fit the lightened model bayonet. Artillery carbines were not fitted with butt plates as they were expected to ride with the carriage and see very little use. 1,451 units with bayonets would arrive in early 1905. These were immediately stolen by the Marechaussee. God, look at those guys. Just like the US Marines of the Dutch East Indies, they keep stealing everything that isn't bolted down. In 1907, 150 more artillery carbines would be shipped. These were also stolen. So in 1908, the artillery was armed with long rifles instead. It would take until 1912 for the Marechaussee to finally have enough carbines of their own that they would return the artilleries, which they had, of course, modified into their own standard pattern. So all of them had been transformed into this little carbine pattern and needed to be transformed back into this artillery pattern, at which point it seems they went ahead and just kept the metal butt plate that the Marechaussee put on them. Overall, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 artillery carbines would be made for the NIL. However, once again, we will see them cannibalized even after they were restored for another model. Okay, I'm gonna admit something. The weird twists and turns and constant transformations in the Dutch East Indies has dang near broken my ability to tell a linear story here. I keep having to explain a shortage of a gun by introducing a whole other gun, which in turn is stolen to produce yet another gun. So stick a pin in this one. We are coming back to it in a moment. I promise. I'm just trying to get us roughly into some sort of linear order. In 1938, it was decided to gradually convert whatever remained of those artillery carbines into, you will never guess it, the Marechaussee once again. The Second World War might have interrupted that process, so some artillery models might still exist, though I'm unsure how many, if any. Walking back to about when the artillery were finally getting their 1904 carbines all the way into 1912, well, it turns out the cavalry are spending some time dismounted, and we're starting to see other units armed with their carbine. They'd eventually fall into the hands of the cyclists, the aviation, and with the machine gunners. So maybe that cavalry model should take a bayonet, like the standard NIL infantry bayonet. And that's exactly what the commander of the NIL ordered in 1912. Okay, we'll make some new stocks, extend them not quite as far out as the first gun, and fit them with a standard bayonet lug. But not too standard, because the cavalry barrel is narrower than the infantry long rifle. To avoid armory confusion, we're gonna have to mark the cavalry front bands with, well, let's go with CAV. Now happily, I happen to have one of those cavalry carbines right here. It's a bit rough, but I think it'll do for a closer look. Alright boys and girls, welcome to my nightmare, because this gun is absolutely perfect for this demonstration, which tells you something about Dutch carbines. So, at the front we have the usual bayonet lug, front sight, yada. We come down and we can tell that we're in the NIL carbine territory because we have no handguard and we have a turned down bolt. This was unique to the NIL. I know, having said that, I'm going to get a ton of emails. So let me be very clear right now. On the Continental side of things, importation creates all sorts of issues in which stuff gets swapped around. So if you have an example that stands out, congratulations, there's actually a number of them that stand out as being uniquely mixed. I'm not sure why. I know that there were considerations to turn down the bolt on, say, the number 5 Continental. Maybe that's what happened. I'm not entirely sure, guys. This is a field in which there's a lot of research that still needs to be done. And so if you're the kind of person that likes getting their feet all the way in, I highly recommend that you start digging into these Dutch carbines. The Indonesian patterns especially will show up with straight handles or whatever else, because right now the gun you're looking at, I've been through it, there are no 2 serial numbers that match. Not between any 2 components, not between any 2 screws. And that's weirdly common for these because they saw very extended service lives in a harsh environment. And then after you get through World War II, the Dutch government is pushed out and the Indonesian government forms, and then they do all sorts of stuff, including conversions and things like that. So if you're seeing something that doesn't fit the patterns I give you today, you've found something that is now officially modified outside of the purview of the Dutch records. That's all I can really tell you at the moment because I have not gone beyond the 1930s. So luckily, this gun, despite all the mismatched serial numbers, is 99% in the configuration for the cavalry model that we're currently discussing. So, turn down bolt, gas escape vents just like the long rifle. We've got the bayonet lug at the front like I covered, and then if we come on down here, again, we can tell that she's been out in the East Indies because of this relief for the unit marking that is now lost to time. If we look at the back of the gun while we're down here, we can actually now see that, yep, that's that skeletonized button, which we have wood surrounded by a metal frame, which is lighter and consumes less material, presumably. Now, if I flip her over, let me get her where you can actually see her. If I flip her over, we're going to see the very unique and easily identified NEDERLANDSE slings. These guys are not wire like the other slings. These guys are steel ribbon. So they're like a flat, yeah, look at that, flat wide ribbon. They're very light, they're very small, and apparently robust because I've yet to see any of these things trashed. I mean, I've seen them trashed, they're all pitted like this one is, but I've never seen them completely failed. Now, if I bring her to the rear, we'll see that this had a 1930s update because sometime in the 1930s, they switched over to providing gas masks to their cavalry, and in doing so, it became hard to pull this gun out from over their head. This would have originally had that little wire, well, little flat ribbon loop like you saw. Now we have this big wire circle, and that's because this is designed for a quick detach sling point so that they could just detach the sling in order to get it off their backs instead of pulling it over their heads and therefore driving their gas masks into their chins. Now, again, like I said, this gun is a mixed master, so the fact that the receiver is dated 1916 doesn't really tell us much about what it originally was, especially because if we look at the wood, which again is not matched, we'll see that this one clearly at some point in its life actually did have, oops, let me see, there we go. Can you guys, it's like working in a mirror. This ledge right here tells us that this stock originally had a wood piece cover for the magazine. The magazine itself does not seem to have any of the tabs that would tell me that it had that wood piece. However, I do know that since these guns were converted from cavalry to maréchaussée and back and all this sort of thing, they could have been ground off and then re-blued at some point. I actually don't know if the Dutch East Indies forces bothered to grind off the tabs that would have held those wood pieces or not. Those are details that are sadly currently still lost to time, and again, available for people to explore on their own. So if you're the kind of person, again, that wants to do research, it's a very easy place to get digging and find all sorts of gold, I'm sure. Now, sadly, I've been in this gun deep enough to know that even if it is technically safe to shoot at the moment, it's not going to tell us much about the characteristics of a NIL carbine at the time they were issued. So we'll skip the range and once again rewind the clock to 1915 this time and find out what happened to the artillery carbine. Up to 1,000, we're not exactly sure how many, would be transformed into a new pattern for the Genie, or engineers. It was decided in 1915 to equip these guys with the artillery model. However, there was an unexpected problem. The guns they received from storage were a rotten mess. The stocks were bad and the bayonets rusty or missing altogether. Instead of making another round of one-off parts, they chose to borrow from the now quite new cavalry pattern that was still in production. Ultimately, the new Genie carbines came out looking nearly identical to their cavalry brethren. However, they were configured with underside sling swivels. Thanks to their introduction, two guns were now using the same smaller barrel band with bayonet lug, so the CAV marking was dropped and a more expansive KAR marking for carabine was adopted. It's unknown for sure how many Genie carbines were manufactured, the bulk being no more than 1,000 from artillery conversions, though at least one small batch were produced new at the AI in Hembrook. Okay, that is all we are running down today, and after 3 episodes of nothing but Dutch Schlegel milk variations, I'm happy to say there are definitely more out there. Artillery trainers, sub-caliber trainers, police conversions, it goes on for days. As for service life, well, the entire NIL set would mostly be used internally in various campaigns to suppress regional conflicts or rebellion. Even then, the broad majority of action would fall on the shoulders of those maréchaussées, which is why they had so many of them. And it's common to see images like these of men with sword and carbine in hand, a powerful combination. But remember, at the start of all this, I said the 1895 faced the problem of needing to be 2 guns, one for internal use and one for defense against major powers. Well, that latter option finally came in World War II, 40 years after, well, this long boy was introduced. The Japanese invasion was swift and directed at a mixed coalition of Dutch, US, and United Kingdom forces, so it's hard to really rate the 1895 on its utility in this context. Head-to-head, however, it wasn't suffering much against the Type 38 in terms of a cartridge at least, and while there are some design advantages to the Japanese rifle, they don't do much to negate the lethality of the Dutch. Honestly, the loss of the Dutch East Indies had little to do with the land battle. It was much more a naval campaign, and one that was dictated by the actions of Allied powers more so than the limited Dutch. The fall was inevitable, but they did a lot to deny the Japanese vital supplies. The territory would remain occupied until the end of the war. While plenty of these Dutch carbines and rifles were used by guerrilla locals, likely even more than that fell into Japanese direct use. And you'll even find them with modified bayonet lugs in order to take the Japanese Type 30 bayonet. Now, I've heard that the conversion of these to 303 began during the war. I've also heard that it only started after the war, and I have not been able to dig that far in as we are more a World War I show. However, definitely post-war, there was a lot of 303 on hand, and so you'll see the Indonesian forces very actively converting these guns into a set of 303 patterned carbines and even some long rifles. Again, just to use up the British surplus that was around, although that is getting well beyond our story for today, and so we'll leave shooting something like this for another episode in which we can discuss yet a whole other smattering of modifications and variations of Dutch carbines. Given this is the 3rd of 3 episodes, let's get one last look back at what we did manage to cover. If we discount the long rifles and the special gendarme folding bayonet carbines, we get what externally looks like a very diverse group, but in reality, the main components, receivers, barrels, magazines, sights, etc., it's all the same. We've had a bit of a laugh at just how many ways you can dress up a model 1895 carbine, but I think the Dutch Army and NIL hit on something very important, a sort of early modularity and flexibility to redefine the weapon to best fit a role or take advantage of shared parts manufacture. They were willing to treat these carbines much like modern armorers do for adapting them to tasks as needed for lower cost than introducing a new gun. In that regard, the most important thing to remember about the Dutch 1895 might just be its flexibility. Alright, let's get Mae in here and find out how she feels about these guns, the last of the Dutch 1895s. For now. Alright gang, we are on, is this the first time we've done a 3-parter?
I think so, and obviously we have not really even gotten up. I think we've just been sitting here this whole time. It's been like 6 weeks, guys. Hey, I'm a little hungry.
Before we talk about the gun, can I share something with you more personally? This makes me tummy sick because we are filming probably now 2 months ahead of whenever this episode drops.
Oh God, have we ever done that before?
No, and what will end up happening is on episode 1, somebody's going to say something, and it's going to make me want to change something in episode 2 and 3.
Nobody say anything.
And as of this moment that we're filming it, I don't know what that is. And you all do, because I've probably already done something about it, or it's been... Anyway.
It always happens.
Working too far ahead gets very difficult in this game.
It's very stressful.
Yeah, we've never done a triple.
Stressful.
I know, I'm freaking out.
I'm so excited and
Okay,
so
calm down.
anxious.
It's okay. It's okay.
I need a Red Bull.
We're going to be more ahead than we've ever been, and we're going to get punished for it.
Why would you say that out loud?
Here you go.
Listen to this guy.
Now, we have the 1895 NIL, the NEDERLANDSE...
Which is
something.
so
Like a-
different from the Continental, right?
Yeah, I mean, hold on. I still
Because
have
that's
this.
effectively... Yeah.
Here, hold yours high. Hold it high.
High? Okay.
Well, very different. Oh. That is hard to do at full length.
I was
All
proud
right.
of you.
So, the only real difference in this gun is a couple of gas escape holes.
Yep.
And they cut down on the
trimmed
stock.
this, yeah.
And in fairness, this is not an 1895 NIL, technically. In a lot of ways, we would consider this to be an 1895 11 NIL.
That's true.
Because these modifications were made around 1911.
Mm-hmm.
So, what they did is they extended that finger guard.
Yeah.
They extended it a little bit to the rear with the L.
So you can hold it anywhere.
It's more just to get the weight off of there, but
That's fair.
sure.
You can hold it
How's your
anywhere.
reach? You want, yeah.
Okay. I can do it.
And then, trimmed it up at the rear. You guys saw. I already walked you through all this. Does any of that make any difference?
Well, so did it make a difference in the actual weight? I can't tell. I literally can't tell because it's such a little amount of wood that came out of there. So probably, but I can't feel it. Realistically, I will say I did like this little turn up in the finger groove right here.
Yeah, that seems to be original, by the way.
Yeah, I didn't even notice it until afterwards that my fingers were practically falling naturally within this little groove, and as a result, I don't know, my pinky and my ring finger felt pretty comfortable shooting this guy, so I had a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, the extra scalloping does make the NIL feel a little bit narrower, which to me is very comfortable. So, okay, maybe there is something to that trim up.
Just a little bit.
But otherwise, this is going to be the same as the 1895.
Pretty much.
A lower zero, so when you
Yeah.
fired it, you didn't have to hold, for the 1895 Continental, you took what was a deep 6 o'clock hold, and for those of you who don't know, that's like 6 o'clock on the clock, so
Yeah.
she was aimed
So
at the
go
bottom.
find the clock, look at the 6.
Right, she was aimed at the bottom of the target, and then we saw where it hit. On this one, we found that if you aimed at the bottom of the target, it was going to be very low, so you brought that
Yeah,
up.
just up a little bit.
Right. So this shoots a little bit more true at 100 yards or less.
I would agree. Yeah,
But then again, you have to adjust more for further down. So,
that's fair.
anything else?
I was fine with it, but the ranges we were shooting at.
Anything else remarkable?
Nothing else really, especially. I mean, it just doesn't really feel that much difference. Even the action trigger recoil from the Continental 95, nothing really much different from that.
No. I'm going to play devil's advocate for 1 second and say that
Always has to play devil's advocate.
there is, in terms of trimming out all this wood, I will say whenever I get a hold of these, the ones that come over from Indonesia, they always are much darker, and they always seem like the wood has taken on more water over its life. Like, they always seem denser. And so when I hold them up against the Continental, you have to imagine that these stocks probably soaked in a fair bit of moisture when they were in use, even if they were oiled. If they were oiled, they were carrying around oil. So when you remove wood that's being used in a wet environment, you actually remove a little more weight than you think you do. So that's my one little piece of advocacy, is that over the continent, they might have said, these gain an extra couple ounces when they get out here and get soaked. And it's just a much more humid environment, sweltering at times. So we live in the dirty South, so we are well familiar with...
We're used to breathing. It's been raining for like an entire week right now, so that's been awesome.
This thing's been in its natural habitat.
I was only able to mow the front lawn, and I still haven't mowed the backyard, and it's just glaring at me as tall as it is.
Okay, so that gun is no real different than the Continental.
It's hard to feel the difference other than that finger groove.
We have another one,
And it's like,
which is the last version of the cavalry carbine.
true.
We did not get to shoot this, though, because
Unfortunately, no.
as much as it looks a little pitted on the outside, under the barrel is pretty bad, and we just didn't feel like it was worth going through that effort with this gun when we know for a fact how it's going to shoot. It's going to shoot like the other carbines that we've already shot.
Yeah, there's not going to be that huge of a difference in the feel on it. I mean, obviously something as simple as like maybe this finger groove is going to feel kind of weird because that is a really tiny not very well depressed finger groove right there.
To be fair, that's a lot of... It looks like the stock itself has been sanded over time.
Kind of does.
Like, Indonesian carbines especially. The long rifles seem to make it through relatively unchanged most of the time. Indonesian carbines saw post-war use, and so they have modifications done to them. There's often rifle parts that have been scabbed onto them to make them run. The bayonet lug for this one doesn't appear to be original cavalry bayonet lug. Like, this one has no two matching serials. And in that regard, it's going to be stiffer. It's going to be worse than the carbines we shot last time. And that's all age and parts replacement.
I do kind of find the skeletonized butt plate pretty cool, though.
That is kind of an interesting factor. Like, just something to keep the stock from splitting and yet trying to keep as much weight as possible off the gun.
That's weird. I kind of would have liked to have seen if that felt a little bit different in terms of just when the recoil hit me on it. But I don't think it... Just feeling it, I don't think it would have felt that much different, but it is interesting to see.
Oh, no, it's beautiful. I mean, I've never seen anything like that.
Yeah.
Now, the other aspect of this is the original version of this would have been a half-stocked cavalry carbine, which we could not get a hold of. But at that point, you're getting into a very light version of that carbine. And one that you have to be careful not to touch the barrel on, because this has no handguard either.
Yeah, notice I'm just wrapping around it, and like it's not my instinct to naturally do that either. I've been burned a few times.
Yeah, I feel like... You tell me. It's got a turn-down bolt, no handguard. Would you prefer this over the Continentals in terms of mobility?
Yeah, realistically, if I am going to be toting these guns around all day, yeah, lighter is going to be better. So sure, okay, I've lost some wood. It's going to be lighter, easier to walk around with. Problem's going to come with shooting this guy because the lack of the wood, I'm not going to be able to wrap my hand around this easily, and I know these guys are going to cook up pretty quickly. So in that regard, I'm going to prefer those guys. And then especially like even though I know like it's not really going to be with a bayonet since they had the saber, since the bayonet's not really going to be an issue since they had the saber.
Yeah, the bayonet was added much later for these guns.
I still would prefer to have some wood up here in order to effectively use said potential bayonet later on. That would be nice. And then that turn down bolt, weirdly, this one isn't too bad. It's kind of smaller bolt head size than the other guys.
Yeah, I think I have... Here, let me grab one of the Continentals.
Yeah, look at the size difference on that. That is...
Yeah, one of these spheres is much larger than the other.
Yeah, so that's weirdly not a bad grip because there's less mass right here. I'm able to really get my finger up under there in order to grip it. Now, granted, there's a jam or any issues with it. That's going to suck to have to get it open, but... these perform so well that I'd be surprised if there was an issue with it.
I'm going to be honest with you. I kind of agree with the Continental Dutch on this.
Yeah.
I don't like the turn down bolt on that. It should be more out of the way. If I'm riding on a horse, I should prefer it. And that's really why they did it too, is they didn't want it sticking out and hooking on the next guy on narrow trails. And maybe they are correct in that regard, and maybe I'm not thinking about it clearly. But just in terms of operating the gun, this giant bolt knob sticking out at a nice 90-degree angle, especially the size of this guy, these have been some of the easiest to manipulate split breech receiver guns that we've used.
There's no missing that.
Right. You just pop and go. Now, the Continental solution to this was, again, like we saw last episode, that you could decock the gun and then turn the safety on. In theory, that one being a cavalry, even in the NIL, should have had that ability. But again, no two serial numbers matching. I don't even know that that's a original cavalry bolt. It might have come out of an Engineers or something else. Ooh. So that one cannot do the same maneuver. Mind you, it'd be an easy mod. You just cut a notch.
Right.
But the idea that I can lock this bolt so that it cannot be opened and then just ride around like that.
Hey, not too bad.
I'll take the bolt that's easier to palm.
That's fair. I can actually understand that. I can see that.
All right. So obviously the Dutch did not serve in World War I.
No.
But, again, they did have to fight in World War II. They were out in Indonesia with something like that.
That's hard to imagine.
We've already talked about the carbines as a continental thing, okay? Do you feel comfortable with something like this in a dense, crowded, humid, do we feel something like that in a place where we live? Because we live in a dense, crowded, humid jungle. So I guess this is more of our area's gun. Yeah. How do you feel about this as being a tropical rifle?
So for the environment that I'm in here, I would probably prefer definitely some wood up here because it's already going to be hot enough as it is. I imagine these aren't going to cool down that quickly. So yeah, definitely would prefer some wood up top in this environment for one. And then for two, The cartridge kind of would make me nervous in such a dense area. I'd just be worried about penetration, getting through all that lush foliage. So I'd probably want something like the Japanese did, like where we went up to 7.7. Like, that's not a bad idea.
No, it's actually really comparable in some interesting ways. So the Japanese did make use of these guns during their occupation. And then also possibly during occupation, possibly only after. I'm still trying to do the research. A lot of these were converted to 303. As a matter of fact, I think you have a 303 one back there if you want to grab it.
Yeah, it's not mine, but...
You're going to fall out of the chair.
I'm going to fall out of the... You're going to fall out of the chair. Hold on.
So this is an
Movie
Indonesian...
magic.
Yeah, this is an Indonesian in 303. You can tell they put a sort of break on there. And then otherwise, it's mostly the carbine. All this... Actually, this one was made out of a carbine. So... They're not going heavy on any changes to get it up to what would be essentially a 7.7 caliber. The Japanese went with their own 7.7 caliber from 6.5, so they both made a similar decision. Now, in this case, Indonesia did it because of the availability of 303, but you have to imagine there must have been some benefit ballistically as well. So I have not sat down and done the sort of... I'm sorry, do you want that?
Yeah, I kind of want to hold it for a bit.
I have not sat down and done the big research on that, but both the Arisaka and the Dutch KNIL Mannlichers have gone through that same process of starting in 6.5 and ending in 7.7, which is just a weird parallel to consider. We have not shot the 303 yet.
No, we actually have not. That would have been fun, but it's not quite the time for that.
I want to point out that probably is lighter than the number 5 jungle carbine in Lee Enfield.
Oh my god, yeah, it is. Actually, this is pretty light feeling.
Yeah, that will probably be painful.
That's gonna suck.
But that's another episode because as much as we've been through 3 episodes and you've now seen 20 some odd versions of this carbine.
Don't you want them all?
I'm going to tell you, that's not the only 303 version of that carbine. There are more. There are more Dutch carbines. There are always more. The one truth to life is no matter how far you dig, there will always be more Dutch carbines.
So good luck on finding them all.
Now, for those of you who enjoyed this, don't forget we got some extra help from our friend Matthew.
Yes.
We'll have the link with the updates after the credits like we did last time.
Yeah, okay.
He has done some writing on the... You're going to love this. The rolling block carbines, in which the Dutch also made a dozen variations.
Hooray! Don't you want all of the rolling blocks?
So if you'd like to learn more of this, as much as we make fun of it, by the way, I really want to reiterate, that's some early modularity. Like,
yeah, that's actually pretty cool.
You can get a carbine however you want it, whenever you want it, if you're in the Dutch army.
Like, whatever environment you're thrown into, don't worry, the Dutch got you.
We got a carbine for that.
Yeah, that's how the Dutch are. We got a carbine for that.
Yeah. All right. Stay tuned after the credits for the updates, and I hope you guys had a good one.
Night, guys.
Alright gang, number 1, first and foremost, thank you again to Matthew, and boss, I could not have done this work without you. Number 2, some very few of you may say, but Othais, I have a Dutch Mannlicher carbine that does not fit this pattern. Yep, there's actually at least one more model that I know of that has shown up multiple times with a distinct variation. However, we could not prove that it was done by the Dutch versus the Indonesians. We could not prove what it was for, and I did not want to muddy the waters more than necessary. So, if you have any confusion there, let me know and I may be able to get you in touch with the researchers. This is still an undiscovered field. Now, in addition to all that, I need to tell you that if you're on Patreon or Subscribestar, we're getting near the first of the month, so you should see your new scan. I'm very excited about this month's scan, so definitely join in on that if you want to see it. And finally, I have to tell you guys that our next episode will be a special instead of a regular episode. Hopefully you guys will enjoy it very much, but we did have to buy a little extra time. My prediction came true. Whenever we pull ahead, that's exactly when something catches fire. So while I go try to put that out, we have something else for you to enjoy and maybe blow up my comments about. So stay with us. Let us know how you feel about the episode, and thank you for tuning in.